All right, so we are going to be looking at the first of the New Deal programs. So last week I had talked about the fact that in 1832, Americans were really tired of the Republican Herbert Hoover. They basically kind of saw him as not the answer to their problems anymore. They sort of saw this idea of, hey, I'm just going to stand back and not do anything, and the economy's just going to work itself out, as really a non solution to a huge problem. As we know, they ended up naming Hoovervilles after him, which had become homeless communities where, the poor and those who had lost their jobs ended up living. So in 1932, when their Democrat Franklin Delano Roosevelt runs for president, he's going to win pretty easily. When FDR runs for president, really his goal in the first bit is we've got to fix the banks. We have to fix, people's confidence in the economy, because if we don't do those things, we're going to have a huge problem on our hands. And with that fireside chat that we listened to on Friday, you can really see that he's trying to instill confidence in the American people. But besides the not the banking economy, but the banking and the economy itself, he's going to try to fix other things as well. And really the goal with the New Deal is going to be putting Americans back to work. So the first New Deal created agencies that helped ease the burden of the Great Depression. We know that at its highest, unemployment was at 25%. And really for FDR and his administration, putting Americans back to work is going to be really their biggest task and their biggest goal. Their idea is this, is if you can get Americans back to work, that means that they're going to be able to feed themselves, they're going to be able to take care of themselves, provide shelter or a home, clothes, whatever it's going to be that they're going to need. And so if we can do that, that's going to get the economy going on the right track. So the goals of the Depression are what we call the 3 R's. So the first was to provide relief. So this meant that we were going to, relieve the pains that Americans were suffering, whether it was providing more food, more, homeless shelters that weren't Hoovervilles, whatever it may be. But we have to relieve all the pain that the Americans are facing. Recovery, so we have to recover from this. So again, the idea was, putting Americans back to work, getting them jobs, getting them something where they could build themselves out of the poverty. And then, of course, the big one is reform, to make sure that a Great Depression was never going to happen again. So for really, in FDR's fireside chat that we listened to on Friday, his big thing was the banks of, we got to fix the banks. The banks can't be handing out money to people and then not be able, to collect it, or those people not be able to pay them back. Because if the banking system fails, the economy as a whole pretty much fails. And FDR was really aware of that. So relief, recovery, and reform are definitely going to be the big things for him. And of course, the overall objective was to provide a safety net to people. Before we do get more into the New Deal, I want to warn you now, the New Deal, it is dry. It's a little dry. It's not exactly like the sexiest of topics, but I'll kind of tell you like the big New Deals that you really do need to know, that I would recommend that you star, highlight, or do whatever it is that you need to do on your fill-in notes if you're choosing to use those. So one of the first New Deals was the Tennessee Valley Authority, or the TVA. So it built hydroelectric plants and dams aimed at improving 7 southern states and attracting industry to the south. Jobs like hydroelectric plants are kind of industry big jobs. We like to attract those types of jobs because typically those pay a lot more money and they're very good paying jobs. All right, if you work out in an oil rig, or if you work out in a factory, if you work in an industry like this, it's going to pay more than, say, working at McDonald's. And so the government was like, okay, if we can attract people to these types of jobs, it's going to get more Americans better money, better pay, which means the better ability to take care of themselves. However, private power companies were against the TVA because they received government subsidies. A subsidy is when a company would receive money from the government. So it could be because they're doing a certain job or because the government wants them to do a certain something. But a subsidy is to receive money. So you can almost kind of look at the stimulus checks that we got in April almost as like a subsidy, kind of. They're a little bit different, but kind of on that same idea of we're just going to give you money to either spend or to do something. And so private power companies sort of felt that the government was overstepping their boundaries and getting involved in private business when frankly they shouldn't have been. You're going to have the Civilian Conservation Corps, or the CCC. It gave unemployed men ages 18 to 25 the opportunity to work with the National Forestry Service. So think about that. The National Forestry Service, a lot of outdoor work, it's a lot of, manual labor. Why would you want guys that are, say, 18 to 25 years of age? And the reason you want people who are 18 to 25 years of age is because they're young and they're going to be able to, hold a hammer or, chop down a tree a lot better than, say, your 60-year-old grandfather. So the CCC was really about employing young men to work out in the National Forestry Service. So again, it's kind of, making sure that the Forestry Service is cleaned up, but it's also putting people back to work. With the Agricultural Adjustment Act, or the AAA, not to be confused with AAA, who comes and tows your cars or fixes your tires or things like that, this is going to pay farmers to not raise certain crops to lower crop production. Now, why in the world would the government pay farmers to not raise certain crops? Well, again, we have to go back to the 1920s and that post-World War I economy. Because the farmers had overproduced on goods, they had this supply and demand problem where they had so much supply, demand was low, and frankly, they couldn't sell many of their products for really anything. They weren't making any money. In that document number 5 that you guys read last week, when looking at the effects of the Great Depression, you had farmers that were pouring milk out because it wasn't worth anything to them and they weren't able to make money. So they were really frustrated with the government. With the Agricultural Adjustment Act, it was going to pay farmers to not raise certain crops. The idea was the supply would be lowered, demand would go higher, and hopefully that would mean that the farmers were going to be able to make more money, and it would bring the economy kind of back to the farming industry, which had really just been completely tortured with the Dust Bowl in the 1930s. The Federal Emergency Relief Administration, or FERA, it channeled money to help state and local agencies fund relief projects. Usually when we're looking at relief projects, usually infrastructure projects, I would say, is the big one. Looking at building roads, building schools, building bridges, things like that. You can see the women here are typing. You kind of read about that last week in the effects of the Great Depression, that a lot of women got put to work, especially in more secretarial roles. And that's how it kind of became sort of gender stereotype that's like what a woman would do is because of FARA, and that's how many people got put to work. The National Recovery Administration, or the NRA, this is not to be confused with the NRA that we have today, which is a gun rights organization, two totally different things. But with the NRA, the government was very hands-on in industry. One of the things that the NRA is going to do is increase union membership. Typically, when people are members of unions, they tend to, not always, but for the most part, I would say, they tend to have better paying jobs, they tend to have health care, they tend to have vacation pay. So again, the government idea was that if you have more workers that are part of a union, chances are they're going to have better paying jobs, which means that they won't be stuck in a position like they are currently in the Great Depression. The problem is that with the NRA, they're also going to control industrial production and prices with industry-created codes of fair competition. What this means is this: they would come in and tell certain businesses what they could and could not sell products for. So we'll take cell phones as an example. We know that we have Apple. I would say Apple's the big one, and I would say Samsung is the other big one. So you either have an iPhone or you have an Android. We obviously know that there are other phones out there, but we'll just look at Apple and Samsung for this example. If the government came in and told Apple, hey, you're charging well over $1,000 for a phone, we don't think that's right. More people need to have access to phone. You can only charge for a phone for $200. Apple would not be very happy about that because they wouldn't be able to make the same amount of profit. But it also very much goes against the ideal of capitalism, which is this idea that any business can get started in America, they can make a profit, sell things for what they want, and that should be that. And so there were a lot of people who were very frustrated with the NRA and felt that this idea of telling, companies what they could and could not sell products for was basically too socialist and too communist. And so the NRA is no longer around. It was declared unconstitutional in 1935. Unconstitutional just means it is against the law. The Supreme Court got this and said this, violates a lot of American ideas and policies. This idea that government's going to come in and tell companies what they could and could not sell products for. You're also going to have the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. This is the big one, the FDIC. I would star this, highlight it, do whatever it is that you need to do to remember this. When the bank run started occurring after the stock market crash. So this is when people ran to the banks to get their money. The banks didn't have their money. And if the banks didn't have their money, the banks unfortunately ended up closing. If a bank closed before basically 1935, what this meant was that if you had your life savings in the bank, you could not get it back. So if Ms. Toller had $50,000 in the bank in 1931 and the bank closed, that was it. I could not get my money back. What the FDIC does is it provides government insurance for bank deposits up to $2,500. Now, that amount has increased big time. Today, that amount is $250,000. And most banks are a member of the FDIC. Walk by any bank, whether it's Chase, could be Bank of America, could be Citibank. Most of them are going to have this little FDI sticker on the outside of it, meaning that, again, if something were to happen to that bank and the bank goes bad, your money is going to be insured for up to $250,000. So definitely take a look at that sticker. If you ever join a bank that does not have that FDI sticker, get out of that bank. Get a new bank. That is a bad bank. No bueno. Like, get out of there. It is not going to be good. But the FDIC is going to make sure that a situation like the bank runs and banks having to close and not being able to give their money back was never going to occur again. The question that I oftentimes get asked is, well, what if you have more than $250,000? Most of you, unfortunately, in your lifetime, that's never going to happen. But most people who have more money than, I would say, $250,000, they typically have money in like a trust, and trusts operate very differently than a normal bank account. You're also going to have the Public Works Administration, or the PWA. This is going to provide a series of construction jobs, creating additional jobs throughout the country. Again, this is what we would call infrastructure jobs. So, fixing roads or even building roads, building bridges, fixing buildings, things like that. So again, all the work that we're seeing on the freeways, especially the 15 freeway, if you've noticed in Corona, they're building the fast track over off Cajalco. They've been expanding that bridge. That would be an example of the Public Works Administration and the work that they're doing. You're going to have the Civil Works Administration. This is going to hire workers directly to put them on the government payroll. If you know anyone that works in any type of government job, I would also say anyone who works in construction and gets hired for a government job, they tend to like to get government jobs. Government pays well, much better than, I would say, private industry. So the idea of putting people on the government payroll was that they were going to get better paying jobs than they would, say, in private industry. You also have to remember that during the Great Depression, private industry wasn't necessarily doing all that great. So essentially you had the government that was paying people to perform work. You're going to have the Securities and Exchange Commission, or the SEC. This was created to regulate the stock market and prevent fraud. This is definitely still around today. Something that the Securities and Exchange Commission does is to prevent what we call insider trading. So I'll give you this example. Let's say I am the CEO of Target, and I decide to call a couple people who I know have a lot of money at stake and a lot of stocks within Target. And I go, hey, listen, we're going to announce our quarterly sales next week, and they're not going to be good. People are going to be upset, and we're going to lose money. I suggest you dump your stocks now, get out while you can, before you lose a bunch of money. By law, I cannot do that. That is called insider trading. And if you get caught for that, you go to jail for a very, very, very long time. Martha Stewart, if anyone knows who she is, she's the blonde, I think she's in her 70s now, homemaker. She has that show with Snoop Dogg where they like cooking stuff together. She went to prison for a bit of time due to insider trading and the fact that she had gotten the inside scoop and dumped some stocks before she can lose her money. But that is things that the Securities and Exchange Commission really prevents, because again, we know that during the 1920s, people were speculating on the stock market like crazy. They were like, okay, I'm going to invest in this stock because I like this name, or that company seems cool, so I'm going to give them money. And, they really had no idea what it was that they're investing in. So the Securities and Exchange Commission is going to try to prevent some of those problems from occurring. However, there are going to be some challenges to the New Deal. So after Roosevelt's first 2 years in office, both sides of the political spectrum really began to question FDR. So why were some of these sides opposed to the New Deal? So the right, or the Republicans, I'm sure you've heard this in the news all the time. Trump is a Republican, so when we refer to Trump and anyone who's a member of the Republican Party, we always refer to them as the right. So the Republicans became very critical of Roosevelt because he had begun in what we call deficit spending to pay for these programs, which means he's borrowing money. So he's continuously putting the government in debt while putting all these people back to work. And I would say traditionally conservatives aren't a fan of this policy. They're like, listen, we can't keep increasing the debt. This is going to be a huge problem because at some point you're going to have to pay back that debt. And this idea of, sort of spending money without making any money is definitely a bit of the issue. So the Republicans didn't really agree with Roosevelt's policies of, we're going to put all these Americans to work with no real way of paying for it at this time. The Democrats, or the left, on the other hand, Roosevelt, they kind of felt had not gone far enough. They wanted to shift more of the wealth from the rich to the middle class and make sure that the middle class was taken care of. And there's definitely some strong ideology behind this. I would say one of the strongest economies the U.S. ever had was in the 1950s and 1960s. And part of the reason that we had such a strong economy was because America had a very strong middle class. You'll hear this a lot, especially from politicians, of we got to protect the middle class needs to be taken care of, because if the rich get too rich and the poor get too poor, the middle class disappears, and that's not really a good sign of an economy at all. So Roosevelt's going to get extremely frustrated. So the Supreme Court's going to strike down the NRA. Again, they're going to rule that unconstitutional because this idea that the government was going to come in and tell businesses what they could and could not spend their money on, they weren't very happy about. But the Supreme Court's also going to come in and strike down the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which was that act that was going to pay farmers to not raise certain crops. Again, the idea was that you were going to lower supply, raise demand, and kind of hopefully help fix the farming crisis. And what the Supreme Court ruled was this: agriculture is a local matter. It is not a federal matter. It is not the federal government's job to decide what's going to happen in Iowa and Oklahoma and Montana and California. Iowa should get to decide what's going to happen in Iowa. Oklahoma should get to decide what's going to happen to Oklahoma. Montana should decide what's going to happen in Montana. And California should decide what's going to happen in California. They really ruled that this was state matters and not local matters. Well, FDR, he's not going to be too happy about this. So he decides he's going to try this Plan B. And so on February 5th of 1937, FDR announces plans to expand the Supreme Court to 15 judges. And this is what we call court packing. And I'm sure that you've heard this probably in the past couple months if you've been paying attention to the news. When Amy Coney Barrett was being confirmed to the Supreme Court after Ruth Bader Ginsburg died, many people were upset because in 2016, when Antonin Scalia had died, Barack Obama tried to nominate Merrick Garland to the Supreme Court. Mitch McConnell, who's the Senate Majority Leader on the Republican side, refused, saying it's an election year and the president should have no say in who gets to appoint anyone to the Supreme Court. Once that happened, it's what we call sort of like a precedent, that this is something that's going to be followed from here on out. Well, here in 2020, when Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed away, the Supreme Court, or not the Supreme Court, the Senate, and Mitch McConnell said, yes, we are going to allow the president to nominate somebody, and that person was Amy Coney Barrett, who is a conservative. What this is going to do is it was going to put the Supreme Court at a 6-3 conservative majority, which worried, quite a few people. So a lot of people were sort of begging Biden to pack the court, aka put it with people who are going to approve your policies. So look at it this way. If you have 6 conservatives and you have 3 liberals, and, Biden is going to be inaugurated on January 20th. Let's say Biden decides to go with this packing the court plan. He's going to appoint somebody to the Supreme Court, liberal. Now you got 6 conservatives, 4 liberals. Now he's going to appoint another liberal to the Supreme Court. 6 conservatives, 5 liberals. Now another. 6 conservatives, 6 liberals. Now he's going to appoint another liberal. 6 conservatives, 7 liberals. Now he's going to appoint another one. 6 conservatives, 7 liberals, or 8 liberals, excuse me. Now he's going to appoint one more, just for in case. 6 conservative, 9 liberals, to put that court at 15. Why is he appointing all these liberals? Well, he wants to make sure that his policies are going to be approved. That is what we call court packing. So FDR is going to sort of try this policy that, listen, if the Supreme Court is going to shut down my policies, I'm just going to pack it with people who are going to approve it. And Congress basically came in and said no, and said that FDR was undermining the courts, that we have separation of powers. Again, the 3 branches of government, the judicial, legislative, and executive branch. They're separate but equal for a reason. In this idea of court packing, frankly, they weren't going to let FDR get away with it. Some things to keep in mind with the Supreme Court is when somebody is appointed to the Supreme Court, they are there for life. The only way that they leave is if they choose to retire or if they die. So Ruth Bader Ginsburg, she obviously ended up passing away. And then before her, Anthony Kennedy decided to go ahead and retire from his spot. But you have several members on the Supreme Court who are getting up there in age. And so you'll either hear of more retiring in the next few years, or some that are going to end up passing away. With this court packing idea, it did not work. We do not have 15 judges on the Supreme Court. We have 9, and it's been that way for quite some time. Unemployment under FDR is also going to remain high. So in 1932, sort of 1933, unemployment's going to remain really high at 25%. The economy had improved during FDR's first term, but the gains weren't necessarily as great as expected. And again, you really have to go back to FDR's inaugural speech, in which he talked about the fact that, be patient with them. This was going to take time, but, once they got there and once things improved, things were going to be better. And a lot of people, even if the economy wasn't necessarily, getting better, they did see that FDR was trying and they really appreciated that. He's passing as many legislative acts as possible. Like, hey, we got to fix the banks, so let's pass the FDIC. The stock market was a disaster. Let's pass the SEC. People need to get to work, so we're going to pass the CCC. The farmers, they've been suffering, so let's pass the AAA. So even if things weren't working, FDR wasn't afraid to admit that things weren't working. So he was like, if the AAA isn't going to work, then let's pass the CCC. If that's not going to work, then let's pass the PWA. Whatever we got to do to fix the economy, FDR was going to do those things. And so as a result, when he runs again in 1936, as you can see here, he's going to win the Electoral College pretty easily. And he actually does better in 1936 than he did in 1932. Again, because the people saw that he was trying and he really was trying to make things better for America. And again, they really appreciated that and held faith in him that, hopefully under his tutelage, things were indeed going to get better.